Hi, folks. Welcome. People are joining. We'll get started very shortly. A reminder, we are recording this webinar, so you will receive a copy of the recording after part 2 concludes next week as well. If you'd like to put in the chat where you're calling in from, maybe what time of day it is for you, that'd be awesome. Would love to hear from folks. All right, we have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of before we get started. Welcome, thank you so much for joining us this morning to celebrate the launch of our new report, Pesticides and Climate Change, A Vicious Cycle. Most important housekeeping item is we have 2 very talented interpreters, Carmen and Deborah here, who will be translating the webinar into both Spanish and French. So we'd like to get our interpretation set up. I will turn that on in a moment. And if you'd like to listen in either Spanish or French, you'll have the option to choose one of those channels. It would also be great if you'd like to listen in English. There's an English channel. If you choose the English channel, you would be able to hear if Carmen or Deborah are translating questions asked in other languages. So you can stay in the main room, but you won't be able to hear questions translated. If you choose English, you'll be able to hear everything. So I will pass it over to Deborah and Carmen to give those instructions as well in Spanish and French, and then we will turn on interpretation.
Bonjour à tous. Pour les gens qui parlent en français, on va commencer avec l'option dans un moment. L'option, ça va être anglais, français ou espagnol. Alors, vous allez choisir le français et quand on a des questions, vous allez choisir l'anglais. Et les gens qui font deux langues, anglais et français, on va choisir l'anglais aussi pour traduire les questions en anglais ou en espagnol et en français pour la Chambre générale. Merci.
Buenos días para todas las personas que quieren escuchar la presentación en español. Pueden tener acceso a esto a través de la pantalla. A la parte inferior tienen un mapa mundi en donde aparecerá, si usted hace clic allí, aparecerá la opción de español. Por favor, haga clic o seleccione español para poder escuchar la interpretación al español. Si usted nos está escuchando desde un teléfono móvil o desde una tableta, en lugar de un mapa mundi o un icono de mapa mundi, usted encontrará 3 puntos. Haga esa selección, escoja el idioma que quiere escuchar, en este caso será el español, y haga entonces la selección de silenciar el audio original, que en inglés es Mute Original Audio. Desde entonces podrá escuchar la interpretación en el español. Gracias.
All right. Interpretation is on. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, you should see language interpretation available. Click here to get started. You can choose which language you would like to listen in. Again, you can switch channels using that tool. It's a little globe down at the bottom. It says interpretation. So the second thing is we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A after Asha and Margaret present on key report findings. So please use the Q&A box to submit your questions, not the chat box. I will be scanning the chat box, but drop your questions into Q&A to make sure they have the chance to be answered. You can enter your questions in that box at any time during the presentation. Okay, so I think we can really get started. My name is Emily Summerlin. I am PAN's Acting Communications Director. I'm so thrilled we're at the point where we're able to share the findings of this report with all of you. Along with Asha and Margaret, who will introduce themselves momentarily. We also have our amazing IT manager and tech wizard, Clint, to help us out with slides and troubleshooting. If you're not familiar with PAN, our mission is to end reliance on hazardous pesticides and achieve health, resilience, and justice in food and farming. We use grassroots science, strategic communications, and coalition organizing to build power with communities across the United States and around the world to confront the harms of industrial ag and build solutions. PAN North America is one of 5 regional centers who collaborate across the globe to transform food and farming systems. So climate change is obviously one of the most significant challenges facing agriculture and humanity today. However, relatively little attention has been given to pesticides' contributions to climate change or how agroecology could help achieve climate justice. We have been working alongside our partners to raise awareness of this important issue and move policy forward, all culminating in this report, Pesticides and Climate Change, a Vicious Cycle. I will now hand it over to Asha and Margaret to get started on key findings.
Thanks so much, Emily. We'll briefly introduce ourselves. Myself and Margaret Reeves were the co-authors on the report, along with a former policy fellow of ours, Calista Washburn. So I'll get started with introductions. My name is Asha Sharma. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the organizing co-director in California for Pesticide Action Network North America. So I lead our California organizing and policy work. I have a Master of Science in International Agricultural Development from the University of California at Davis, where I concentrated on soil science. And I've been working in the field of agriculture, climate change, and environmental justice for the past 10 years or so. And I'll hand it over to my colleague, Margaret.
Thank you very much, Asha. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Margaret Reeves, Senior Scientist at PAN. My focus areas are agroecology and farm worker health and safety. I've been here for 26 years. And before PAN, in my early years of PAN, I worked in Latin America. And for the last several years, my geographic focus has been on policy work in California and nationally. Pass it back to Asha.
All right, next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. So the first thing we'll be covering is just a quick definition of pesticides and a quick coverage of pesticides and their associated hazards to both human health and the environment. We'll also then get into the report findings on pesticides and climate change, where we'll talk about how climate change impacts are predicted to increase pest problems and also increase pesticide use. We'll also then talk about how pesticides contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and are inextricably linked to the fossil fuel industry, creating a vicious cycle of worsening climate change and worsening pesticide use. Then we'll move into solutions, namely agroecology, which in our view is both the climate-friendly and socially just solution to this vicious cycle. Then we'll talk about policy solutions and what policymakers can do to promote agroecology and reductions in pesticide use. And then we'll move into a Q&A section. And lastly, we'll close with some information about next week's webinar and the final webinar of our series on the report and solutions. Next slide.
Thank you, Asha. The slide. There we go. Thank you, Clint. All right. Well, pesticides are generally designed, they're chemicals generally designed to kill, thus the name pesticide, biocide. They are insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, antimicrobials, etc. They carry both acute and chronic health risks. In terms of acute or short-term risks, those include central nervous system impacts like dizziness, sweating, blurred vision, respiratory problems, skin and eye irritation. There can be very severe dermatitis and rashes, or gastrointestinal problems like nausea, vomiting, and in, of course, the worst case scenario, death. Our colleague Emily Marquez, together with PAN International Partners in 2020, published a paper, a systematic review of unintentional acute pesticide poisonings, and they estimated 385 million poisonings occur from agricultural pesticides each year globally. In terms of chronic impacts, those range from cancer to reproductive and developmental harm, increasing evidence of linking Parkinson's disease with pesticide exposure and others. And I'm just going to give a couple examples. With respect to cancer, in the United States, there are about 2.4 million farm workers working on the front lines of exposure to agricultural pesticides. A study of a couple decades ago looked at the incidence of cancer in farm workers compared to the general Hispanic population. The vast majority of farm workers in the US are of Latin American origin, excuse me. And those findings showed that farm workers are 60 to 70% more likely to develop certain types of leukemia, stomach cancer, cervical cancer, and uterine cancer. One other example, I'll talk about developmental disorders. There's an excellent long-term study located in the Salinas Valley of California, one of the most productive, agriculturally productive regions of the state. This study, the Chamaco study, conducted by a group of University of California researchers, have followed a cohort of women in this farm worker community since they were pregnant in 1999. Their kids are now in their 20s. Some of the early findings, all of which are publicly available, were that the kids with the greatest exposures to organophosphate insecticides had pervasive development disorder with symptoms consistent with autism, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and lower IQ. A number of other results as well, but that's some examples of the chronic effects. Pesticides are also widely recognized to be among the top drivers of biodiversity losses worldwide. And globally, pesticide use increased 17% between 2005 and 2020 to about 2.6 million metric tons. And those are data from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Next slide, please.
All right. So the take-home message of this slide is really in this first quote here that is from our new report being released today that says the compounded effects of climate change and pesticide use fall predominantly on the shoulders of people of color, both a climate and racial injustice. And then we have a couple examples of what this looks like. So this first statistic really shows how residents of color in California are most exposed to pesticides. The statistic reads 60% of zip codes with the highest proportion of residents of color host more than 95% of agricultural pesticide use in the state. That statistic comes from the California Environmental Protection Agency. And when we talk about residents of color, we're namely talking about majority Latinx communities. As Margaret mentioned, we're specifically often talking about farm workers, many of which are Latinx immigrants from Mexico, and many of which are undocumented. So an example as well of how climate impacts are anticipated to predominantly affect people of color is in this photo below, where you'll see a photo of farm workers in California that are working adjacent to a wildfire in an agricultural field and are most certainly being exposed to hazardous smoke from the wildfire. And importantly, we see that the impacts of climate change are anticipated to compound or worsen health impacts from pesticide exposure. An example of this is high heat, which is an anticipated climate impact that will impact people around the world. And unfortunately, the data shows that folks that are impacted by high heat, the high heat actually makes their bodies more susceptible to pesticide poisonings. And at the same time, high heat creates a disincentive to wear protective gear, which oftentimes raises one's body temperature, thereby also potentially creating more routes of exposure to agricultural workers and farmers as well. And just to note, we in this slide are using a lot of examples from California, but the report itself and all of these trends are also reflected internationally. So an example of this is Margaret mentioned how many farmers of color in the global south are impacted by pesticide poisonings. And also research shows that countries in the global south will be more severely impacted by climate change as well. Next slide.
Thank you, Asha. So this slide, waiting for it to appear. I don't see it yet. I will continue.
I can see it on my end, Margaret.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So
Margaret,
the thesis.
Margaret and Asha, just to please slow down for the interpreters.
Oh, sorry. I will do. Okay, the thesis for today is a description of the pesticide problem, including newly compiled information on the contribution of pesticides to climate change and how agroecology offers the solution. The graphic on the left, we see that with climate change, pest pressures increase, use of synthetic pesticides increase, and the emission of associated greenhouse gases in what we're calling the vicious cycle. In contrast, the graphic on the right shows that the application of agroecological practices decreases pest pressures through increasing soil health and plant resilience to pests, also increasing both above ground and below ground biodiversity, and the concomitant increase of natural enemies and control of pests, such that pesticide use of synthetic pesticides is vastly reduced or eliminated altogether, as is the associated release of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so climate change and pests. Building on this 2021 briefing that then PAN intern Chloe Cho produced, we see that pests during climate change increase for a number of reasons. Pest ranges increase with temperature. Of course, there are regional variations in the movement of pests. We also see that at increased temperatures, the reproductive rates of pest populations may increase. And we also see in the cases where winter chills that previously inhibited or stopped reproduction of pests no longer does, and so pest populations increase there as well. We see that climate-stressed plants are more susceptible to pests, that natural controls decrease as climate change disrupts the synchronicity of pests and their natural enemies. And we see that pesticides degrade more rapidly at higher temperatures, decreasing their efficacy. And the age-old phenomenon of pesticide treadmill persists, in which pests inevitably develop resistance to pesticides, and those pesticides that kill natural enemies that are no longer able to control what would be pests become pests. Thus, all of these factors together contribute to increased pest pressures, increased use of synthetic pesticides, and of course, the associated emissions of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please.
Great. And I'll be covering how pesticides themselves are contributing to climate change. So importantly, synthetic pesticides are pesticides made through industrial processes. These are the most common type used in conventional agriculture today. And importantly, synthetic pesticides are petrochemicals, meaning that they are ultimately derived from petroleum. And a statistic that really illustrates this point is from our partners at the Center for International Environmental Law, which shows that 99% of synthetic chemicals, including pesticides, are derived from fossil fuels. And major oil and gas companies that we're all familiar with, we listed some on this slide, like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Shell, all produce pesticides or their chemical precursors. Our research also found that pesticides contribute to greenhouse gas emissions throughout their life cycle, though rarely are there any studies that look at the greenhouse gas emissions related to the full life cycle of a pesticide. So this starts with production and ends all the way with application of the pesticide and post-application impacts on soil. We do an original calculation in the report showing that the manufacture of 1 kilogram of pesticides requires 10 times more energy than 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizers have rightly received a lot of attention due to their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. In the report, we argue that because pesticides release similar amounts of greenhouse gases, and because they're both derived ultimately from petroleum when they're synthetically made, that really we would like to see pesticides raised to the same level of visibility as nitrogen fertilizers when we're talking about contributions to greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector. So the main take-home message from this slide is ultimately that oil and gas companies that we already listed, as well as pesticide manufacturers like Bayer, Syngenta, BASF, are all ultimately responsible for climate change because they are continuing to promote and ultimately profit off of the sale of fossil fuels. Our report also finds that oil and gas companies and pesticide manufacturers have followed a similar playbook. They've strategically worked to promote flawed solutions to the climate crisis. For oil and gas companies, this includes promoting carbon capture and storage through new technologies. For pesticide manufacturers, this includes promoting things like new digital agricultural tools, such as precision agriculture. Both of these examples ultimately offer limited climate benefits while allowing these corporations to continue business as usual and continue profiting off of fossil fuels. In conclusion, the fossil fuel industry, pesticides, and industrial or conventional agriculture, as we know it today, are inextricably linked. We can't address climate change without addressing the dependency that conventional agriculture has on fossil fuels and pesticides. Next slide.
Thank you. So now I'll talk about pesticide contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the process of application in comparison with what Asha just presented. In 2018, the last year for which pesticide use data are publicly available in California, the state used 209 million pounds of pesticide active ingredients in agriculture. That's about 95,000 metric tons. Fumigant pesticides, like chloropicrin, have been shown to increase nitrous oxide production in soils by 7 to 8-fold. Nitrous oxide is about 300 times a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Of those 209 million pounds of pesticides, the top 5 fumigants in California accounted for about 22 million pounds of active ingredient applied in that year. Some pesticides themselves are powerful greenhouse gases. Sulfurofluoride, for example, has nearly 5,000 times the potency of carbon dioxide. And in that 1 year alone, there were 3 million pounds of sulfurofluoride applied in California agriculture. The picture here is of the application of a fumigant, followed by putting plastic on top so that the gaseous highly hazardous pesticide doesn't escape. It needs to be gaseous to distribute through the soil profile. And here we have workers at risk of exposure because they have to be there to put soil on the ends of the plastic so that the fumigant doesn't escape. Many pesticides release volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, as well. VOCs react with nitrous oxide to produce ground level ozone, an important greenhouse gas also, and it's harmful to both humans and plants. In fact, the US Department of Agriculture says that ozone is the most important air pollutant in terms of inhibiting plant growth. In terms of human exposure, those people most at risk from exposure to ground level ozone are children, those with asthma, older adults, and people who are active outdoors, including, of course, farm workers. Children are at the greatest risk because their lungs are still developing. They're more likely to have asthma than adults. And they're, of course, active outdoors when they're outdoors. Next slide, please.
Okay, great. So we've hit you with a lot of depressing statistics. So I get to talk about the solution. And the good news is that agroecology, which is the solution we'll be talking about, is already practiced by farmers around the world today. So just to give you a quick definition of what we mean when we say agroecology, agroecology means working with nature rather than against it, using ecological principles, minimizing the use of synthetic chemicals. That includes both synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, all while centering the decision-making power and knowledge of farmers, farm workers, Indigenous people, and local communities. So we have a couple examples of this slide here of farmers in California that we've worked with who are currently practicing agroecology today. The first farm that I'll talk about is Crece Urban Farms, which is the farm pictured here on the right. It's a cooperative farm focused on providing food and just employment to the Latinx migrant community in Santa Ana, California. They haven't used pesticides in 4 years now. They attribute this to their high crop diversity and through building soil health and, by extension, healthy crops through applying mulch and compost to the soil. They also consistently rotate to different crops without the same pest or disease susceptibilities as their previously planted crops to prevent buildups of any one pest or disease. The other farm that we've worked with, Kandarian Organic Farms, is pictured on the left. This is a 138-acre farm based in Los Osos Valley, California, where they grow more than 1,000 crops. Farm owner Larry Kandarian has farmed organically by, in his words, learning to live with the weeds. He manages weeds by using an implement called a drag that was invented by another local farmer that essentially shaves the weeds down to a manageable level. He also points to crop diversity and planting different crops together that work together to provide each other ecosystem benefits as key ways to provide, in his words, more good bugs than bad on his farm. Next slide, please. Marg, you're muted.
There we go. It's unmuted. Can you hear? Can you? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So, agroecological practices contribute both to climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. These practices reduce, of course, the pesticide-associated greenhouse gas emissions, as we've already mentioned, but they also sequester carbon, both in the soil as soil organic matter and above ground in biomass, especially effective if that biomass is woody or other perennial species. These practices also increase system resilience, that is adaptation, helping farmers adapt to climate change. By providing the greater soil organic matter that holds on to, sorry about that, it better holds moisture and delivers moisture to crops, important during droughts. Better soil organic matter helps build soil structure, which in turn helps water infiltrate better through the soil profile, important in times of excessive water. They also increase biodiversity, as we've said, both above and below ground, supporting an abundance of natural enemies. They impart greater resilience to economic stress through diversified production, having many crops for food, fiber, medicines, supporting healthy, nutritious diets in their communities, in the communities that they serve. And they support local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge in a framework of social justice, which also imparts community resilience. One key element for the successful implementation of agroecological practices is the assurance of long-term access to land so farmers can invest the time and energy necessary to achieve these benefits. Hence the frequent calls for land tenure reform in the US and around the world. Next slide, please.
All right. So policy solutions. This is really a key moment to raise the profile of the benefits of agroecology and pesticide use reduction from the perspective of mitigating and adapting to climate change, especially with billions of dollars currently being invested in climate smart agriculture programs on the international, federal, and state level. So the solutions that we offer in the report really fall under these three buckets or three bullet points on the slide. So first, we're recommending that pesticide use reduction targets, as well as overall toxicity reduction targets, and agroecology be included as strategies in climate change policies. Examples of these policies include California's scoping plan, which is California's plan of how it will become carbon neutral by mid-century. Another example is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then secondly, we think it's really critical to increase technical assistance and direct incentives for farmers to adopt or continue agroecological practices. This is especially important that resources be directed to small-scale farmers, to beginning farmers, and historically discriminated against farmers of color as well. Lastly, and most importantly, we think it's critical to increase the rights of those most impacted by pesticide use and climate change and redistribute power in our food and farming systems. A couple examples of what this looks like would be granting an immediate pathway to citizenship for immigrant farm workers, many of which in California and the US are undocumented. And their undocumented status can often prevent them from speaking up about workplace abuses like pesticide exposure because of fear of deportation. Another example that we support in the report is the land back movement, or the returning of land to Indigenous stewardship. This is especially critical given that Indigenous communities steward 80% of the world's biodiversity today. And you'll hear more about all of these solutions at our next webinar as well, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail at the end of this webinar as well. All right, next slide. Great. So we will now be moving into the Q&A session of the webinar. We have some instructions here on where you can find the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. We also have interpretation ready. So if you are a Spanish speaker or a French speaker, please drop your questions in the Q&A box as well, and we will get to as many questions as we can. And Emily will be facilitating the Q&A session, so I'll hand it back over to her. And again, we'll close out with some more information about how you can contact us for more information, and also give some more information about the next series or the next webinar in this series, where we'll be diving more in depth about the solutions to this vicious cycle. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Asha and Marg, for all that amazing information. We have a lot of questions. We will not get to all of them, but Asha and Marg's email addresses are going to be on the last slide of this presentation. I'm keeping track of questions so we can hopefully send you answers if we don't get to them. And you can also follow up as well. So let's try and get to as many as we can. We have a question around if PAN advocates for increased organic production when advocating for agroecology, and how those two terms relate to each other.
I'd be happy to start, and then Asha. Okay, so we absolutely advocate for organic, in part because there is a very concrete set of standards that one can then feel confident that there is integrity in the label and we know exactly what organic means. That said, agroecology goes decidedly beyond organic as it addresses the social, political, economic conditions in which agriculture is practiced. Agroecology is very much a political movement, not just one of sets of practices, but we absolutely support organic, and we do so at the policy level in California, of course, very strongly, and then at the federal level as well. For example, in pushing for more support for organic research and support for organic practitioners in the U.S. Farm Bill. Asha, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that sounds good. I think another reason why we tend to go beyond organic certification in our work when we're talking about solutions is not only, as Margaret mentioned, which I think is really key, is that agroecology gets at more of the fundamental reasons why we have the conventional extractive, exploitative agricultural system that we see today, which is really underlying social and racial injustices and discrimination. But also that sometimes it doesn't make sense for especially small scale farmers to certify as organic because it can be cost prohibitive, for instance, for them. So we try to also support local farmers that we know are also practicing agroecology that might not necessarily have a certification, but they are in fact, organic, not using synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, but just don't have the certification for various reasons. And those farmers definitely should be part of the solution and part of the farming systems that we're supporting.
Great. Thanks, Marg and Asha. The next question is around pesticide reporting. California has the best system for pesticide reporting in the world. Can you explain why this information is not available as of 2018?
There's two things here I'd actually like to address. One is the pesticide use reporting. And that question, in fact, we'd have to punt to. Yes? Can you not hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh dear. All right, I'll keep going unless you chime in. Okay, so the question about pesticide. Okay, the question about pesticide use reporting, we would have to punt to the Department of Pesticide Regulation, who is responsible for releasing those pesticide use reports. And I'll take the opportunity to mention that California also has one of the most comprehensive pesticide illness reporting systems, but those reports, even though it's one of the most comprehensive systems, we know that many or perhaps most cases of pesticide illness do not get reported because of the reasons that Asha mentioned. Many farm workers fear what would happen if they job loss or deportation if they were to report, if they recognize the signs and symptoms, if they had access to medical care, and if the physicians who are required to report understand the reporting system and how to report. So there are many reasons for which pesticide illnesses go unreported as well. Thank you for that opportunity to throw that in there.
Thanks, Marg. A next question. What's the current advocacy strategy in the US to try and transform policies for less pesticides and more agroecology?
I can jump in and talk about our California strategy, and then Margaret, maybe you can talk about a little bit what the national team is doing. So right now in California, I mentioned the California Scoping Plan. There's various other kind of plans and climate-related policies and strategies in California. Another is the Climate Adaptation Strategy. We also have various what are referred to as climate smart agriculture programs that are funded through the Department of Food and Agriculture in California. And so right now, what we've really tried to do is ensure that these different climate policies and strategies are including pesticide use reduction and agroecological practices and ecological pest management as key strategies to achieve the goals of these policies. So right now, and I know this is also a relatively new sector in general for policymakers to be considering in terms of the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Agriculture was just included for the very first time in California's scoping plan, or its plan on how it will achieve carbon neutrality. So really, we're trying to take this opportunity to ensure that the solutions we've talked about, agroecology and pesticide use reduction, are included in these policies. And we're doing that in various ways through submitting public comment, meeting with state agency folks, and trying to get this research on their radar, organizing with partners and meeting with our partners and policymakers and trying to get this information out here. And we've been moderately successful so far. We weren't able to get a pesticide use reduction target included in the scoping plan, but the scoping plan in California this year did include an organic adoption target for the first time, which, as we talked about, is good. Doesn't cover everything that we want to see in terms of the transformation that we want to see in agriculture. But we're a little limited because right now California is only looking at carbon emissions and sequestration related to agriculture in the scoping plan. So that maybe was a little more detail than that person was wanting, but wanted to give some tangible examples. Margaret, do you want to fill in anything that I missed?
So we partner with many different organizations that are working on federal policy to support organic and other agroecological practices, sustainable ag practices. Every 5 years or so, the US passes the Farm Bill, which is an enormous omnibus package of bills that really dictates the vast majority of agricultural policy. One of those organizations with whom we work is the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. There's the Rural Coalition, National Family Farm Coalition, and many others who work on these farm bills every 5 or so years. But then also in the interim, there's all the associated regulations, implementation, enforcement. And that's where we work very hard to push for support, incentives, demonstrations, research for implementation of those practices, including rural development. Of course, remember that the food bill or the farm bill, the largest portion of the farm bill is actually for what we call food stamps or the SNAP program. That is food assistance for people who need it. So a lot of effort on that as well. And there are many people on this call who represent those organizations, and I can put people in touch with them as well if anybody's interested and want to follow up. Thank you.
Thanks, Marg. Okay, next question about resources. Do we have resources available, or can we point folks to resources for farmers who want to know more about their rights and where they can report pesticide malpractice?
We are not a farm organization. So what we would do is link people to those farm organizations. We have certainly farmer-led organizations in California, and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is a coalition of more than 200 farmer-led organizations or farmer-serving organizations. And so that would be a great resource. In terms of reporting violations of pesticide use, that falls under the jurisdiction primarily of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, at least with respect to worker protections. And that responsibility is of the state lead agency in each state responsible for implementing that. So to report pesticide use violations, it would be a state agency that answers to the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. In other parts of the world, I can't answer that question, unfortunately.
Thanks, Mark. What has prevented agroecology from becoming a more prominent climate solution in agriculture?
I think Margaret had a good answer to this. I mean, I think one of the issues is obviously we're up against corporations that are collectively worth billions of dollars and have lots of lobbying money at their disposal to promote the solutions that they're most interested in that we've talked about, like digital agriculture tools, like precision agriculture. And as we've talked about in our definition of agroecology, what it really means is democratizing power in our food system. There's not a lot of money to be made off of that system relative to our current conventional ones, especially for the folks that have the most power to shape what our food system looks like, because we're talking about, you know, solutions that really just center existing knowledge from communities. So there is a lot less, from that perspective, money to be made than there are in other solutions that I think have received more attention in climate change policy and dialogue. But Margaret, I would love to hear what you have to say on this too, as someone who's worked in agroecology for a long time.
Oh, goodness, sorry, I just lost my connection and came back on. I can add, I think, a little bit to that. I couldn't hear it all, but one comment that I made when we had a question from a reporter the other day was that, it was about the narrative of producing enough food. And I said, well, if we took all that agricultural land that is dedicated to the production of field corn and soy for feeding cattle and for producing processed foods and food-like products. And we put that land into the production of high quality, diverse food that could feed the populations in the areas in which it's produced and beyond. We'd be a long road towards actually widespread application of agroecological practices. I don't know if that actually answered the question because I was disconnected for a moment there, but carry on.
That was great. Thanks, Mark. How can we provide support to farmers to feel the security to make the transition toward agroecological growing practices?
That's a great question. We do think that we need a restructuring of how assistance works in food and farming. So there's a lot of subsidies, billions of dollars of subsidies going into agriculture. And right now there's billions of dollars too going into climate smart agriculture programs. But these typically aren't structured to incentivize farmers to adopt agroecology and look at full system transformation. And we do see that there's a lot of barriers to transitioning at first, especially, getting new equipment, and there can be upfront costs. So that's why one of the key solutions that we offer in the report is really directing more of that funding to direct incentives to farmers to adopt agroecology and kind of overcome some of those initial barriers that exist. It might be, temporary drops in yield that some farmers report or new equipment that's needed. So we do especially recommend direct incentives to farmers, especially small scale farmers, farmers of color, and beginning farmers who really need that funding the most and have historically been left out of those types of funding supports. And I'll hand it over to Margaret. I think there's a lot more I could say on this, but yeah.
Because of my poor connection, I missed the question.
It was around how we can provide support to farmers to feel the security to make the transition to agroecological growing practices.
Oh, okay. Well, I heard much of Asha's answer. I guess one thing I don't think that she mentioned is the role of procurement. Governments spend a lot of money on buying food, whether it's in institutional situations, schools, prisons, hospitals. Some of that's not government, it might be private, but that is a powerful economic engine. And if those procurement dollars, and there are some programs already set up, like Good Food Purchasing Program, for example, if those powerful purchasing dollars could support the agroecological practices, then that would go a long way to supporting those growers, because of course, market is the bottom line. You've got to be able to sell your product. And so if you had guaranteed sales or a privileged access to sales because of the practices you use, that would be very powerful. That's just one additional comment.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, this is going to be our last question. Why has there been a historic relative lack of research on pesticides and their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as their impacts on soil health?
I can maybe start and then also hand it off to Margaret again. We definitely see that there's a lack of research and found it difficult when we were doing our literature reviews. We do know that the folks that are predominantly studying pesticides are pesticide manufacturers. They're the ones that are funding the studies. They also have access to information that we just don't as a general public. So as you all might know or might not know, in the United States, pesticide manufacturers only have to make public the active ingredient in a pesticide formulation. They don't have to disclose other ingredients in the pesticide that are referred to as inert ingredients that are supposed to help with the overall efficacy of the pesticide. But actually, oftentimes, inert ingredients can actually make up the majority of a product. They can also be pesticides or other dangerous chemicals. So pesticides are notoriously really difficult to study because so little information on what's in the formulation is available, and it's very difficult to therefore do full life cycle studies on cumulative greenhouse gas emissions related to pesticide use. And I think there also just hasn't been as much attention paid to pesticides generally as a climate change solution, or reductions in pesticide use as a climate change solution and policy. And I think the research and the policy and how both need to pay more attention to pesticides, I think they're related to one another and feed one another as well. Do you have anything to add, Margaret?
Sure, I'll add to that. If the concern about pesticides and the impacts on human health and the environment are public concerns, one would think that the public universities would be at the forefront of doing the research to protect public health and the environment. Most unfortunately, over the last 50, 60 years, the control of the research agendas at the public universities have been increasingly led by the industry interests. And in fact, just one little anecdote was I saw a 1953 journal from Organic, the precursor of what is now the Organic magazine out of Rodale. And there was a prediction in 1953 that the land-grant schools were going to be subsumed or in terms of research agendas by the industry. Lo and behold, they could not have predicted it better. And what we see now is much of the research at public institutions being conducted by and for the chemical industry or the agrochemical industry.
Thanks, folks. Okay, so we just have a couple minutes left and we have some wrap up items to share with you. Can you go to the next slide, Clint? Okay, so there were questions in the Q&A box about how to access the report. The report is now live. It is in the resource library section of our website in English, Spanish, and French. And you'll also be receiving a direct link to the report via email after the webinar concludes. And a reminder that this is just part one of this two-part launch webinar. So we heard from Marg and Asha as report authors on key findings. Part two will be in 1 week, same time, next Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Please check your time zone. And the next installment will be focused on solutions. So we'll be talking about agroecological farming systems, farm worker rights, and indigenous land management. We have 3 incredible speakers: Iowa farmer Rob Fox, who is also on PAN staff, Naimeen Martinez of the Central California Environmental Justice Network, and Jeanette Acosta of Weaving Earth. So that information, you don't need to do anything. You're already registered for part 2. We'll just be sending the link out, and we ask that you add it to your calendar as a reminder. You'll get another reminder email 24 hours ahead of time. So just look for the report and those details in your inbox. Asha and Marg, anything else to add?
No, just thank you all so much for joining. We're really excited to continue building a movement together to support agroecology and transformations in our food and farming system. So please get in touch if you all have any other questions that we didn't get to. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all. And you'll see at the bottom.
Well said. Thank you very much.
You'll see at the bottom of this slide our website and our social media channels where you can stay updated. You can also sign up for our email list. And Clint, I think if you go to the last slide, some of our contact information is on there. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar and a recording of part 2. So we're looking forward to seeing you all hopefully next Tuesday. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.